Hello everyone, I am Grandmaster Fodor Tamas, and we are going to look over a few different opening traps and opening tricks you can use or like learn so you won't fall into a little bit of problems in the opening. So obviously in opening theory there's lots of different openings, everyone is playing different things, but what is one of the most important things you can look out for is anytime you see something new, something strange, you want to be careful about, like what could come out. Oh, sorry about that, let me try. Is it any better now? It should be. Okay, any better now? It should be somewhat higher. If it's not okay, I can try to change some settings. Still not. Alright, let me just try. I'm trying to work that one out. Alright, let's try to just speak up, because that might be the easiest way to improve. Okay, so what we were talking about, like opening traps. Now everyone, like you mentioned, different openings, different traps, but a few things does come common in every kind of opening, and that is that development gives you an advantage which you can use to get ahead and sometimes create tricks. So for example, one of the most famous, well, not the most famous, but one of the oldest tricks is something in Italian, which most people should have seen before and should be able to like handle it. So after e4, e5, knight after knight c6, bishop c4, going into the Italian. Now bishop c5 is the main move here, which most people do play. There are some other variations like knight f6, where there are some openings, maybe like the fried liver, which could come out as an opening trap. But after bishop c5, one of the main things, especially at the club level or like the beginner level, which happens, is that white plays c3, trying to go for the strong attack with white to push in the middle and taking control of the center. Now black has to play knight f6, which is like very logical, trying to fight attacking the pawn on e4, and white goes d4. Now here there are quite a few moves, but the first game I think which was in chess databases like left on was played in this opening in like 18, maybe I think the 1600s, by Greco, who's like one of the oldest players you have leftover games from. And in his opponent, who we don't know who he is because he only left up his own name, none of his opponents, in the old books that has been found, opponent played bishop to b6, which is already a mistake. Now, can anyone name me? It's a very simple little tactic. How can you get ahead with white and just like get a winning position? So, does anyone know how to just completely dominate and win here with white? I will give a little time. Okay, so not seeing much yet, but we'll try to work it out. So the best move for white is to just capture e5, get an extra tempo onto the knight. Knight g5 was not enough, because this is something which people should know. Knight g5 is obviously threatening the pawn on f7, which is a very, very strong threat. But usually when the opponent, so black, is able to go castle and defend the f7 pawn with the rook and the king, it's just not enough. Because, I mean, most people say 2 pieces against the rook and the pawn is not really worth it early on. So like obviously we could capture here and do all these trades, but the 2 pieces in middle game are stronger definitely than a rook and a pawn, especially in this kind of position where white doesn't have a follow-up. So knight g5 is usually not strong enough if it can be followed up with castle, and that's defending the f7 pawn. So the move is d takes e5, because it's taking the pawn, attacking the knight obviously, and the black knight has to move now. So the knight could move to 5 different squares. Obviously a lot of them are immediately losing. Knife, black goes knight to g4, trying to get some counterattack. Then you have a few tricks here again with white. One of the moves which is very strong now, which is something I think mentioned, is bishop f7. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's a little bit of a different move order, because now the king has to take obviously, otherwise it's just a pawn, and then we have this knight g5 check, which is just kicking away the queen, and once the king moves wherever he goes, you can just take this knight with a nice little trick, and you won a pawn. Now, but after knight to e4, the question is, what would we do now? Because knight g4, bishop f7 is really good. The question is it the same thing, or can we do something better? So how could white just finish off this game? I think I saw the move, yeah. It is queen to d5, creating a very common fork or double attack, as you say, which is one of the most common tactics, and to get ahead. Now obviously the checkmate is just a giant threat, so black would have to go probably castle, but then we just take the piece, and it is already a winning by being a piece up early out of the opening. Now a lot of these openings, which most of the opening tricks, there are a few different ones which you can kind of like, I would group opening traps into 2 different kinds. So when you have traps which are happening in a completely normal opening and you just have to look out for, which is I think completely okay. I would play it, I am happy to try it, but if the opening itself only works because of a trap which your opponent should fall into, then that's usually not a good opening, because that means it's really depends on your opponent. If he falls for it, then you are in trouble. Like for example in this position at the beginning, after d4, bishop b6, like we mentioned, is really, really bad. But black can capture on d4, which is actually completely fine. And then there are some multiple moves, but bishop b4 is the main variation, which should be about equal if both sides play it well. So, but let me so this opening is playable, it's completely fine, but it depends on who you play. But let me show you now an opening trick, which is really just asking for some hope for the opponent. So the move comes d4, so we switch to something. Yes, someone already mentioned it, so let me just switch to that, because that was also something I wanted to show you, and that is, like someone mentioned, the England Gambit. Which is opening against d4. So after d4, e5 is called the England Gambit, which is not so good. So the main trick is obviously you are fighting for the center, trying to break up and like surprise the opponent. So now white would capture the pawn, which is the most logical move. Knight to c6, trying to go after the pawn. And here, again, white goes knight f3, which is just developing and defending the pawn at the same time. Now, if white would have played something like f4, then the gambit would kind of work, because the idea is that now the black square is kind of weakened up, and then black will have compensation for the pawn. But after knight f3 comes the move queen to e7, which is the main idea behind the England Gambit. Bishop f4, trying to defend the pawn on d5, which is pretty straightforward. And comes the move queen to b4, which is a check, and at the same time attacking the bishop and the pawn. So this is called the England Gambit. Now here we have three threats: the king, the bishop, and the pawn. So the most logical move to defend is to come back with the bishop, because otherwise it's going to be harder to defend our rook. So comes bishop to d2, and comes queen takes b2, which is the main idea, threatening our rook in a1. So does anyone know what should white do here to follow this up? Because we have a problem with our rook hanging. That's right, so some people do know it. The move is, which is the best move, and actually it is the only move for white, but it is a winning move, is knight to c3. Like, it's not completely winning, but it gets a big advantage. So the whole idea of this England Gambit is, let me just show you first why it's not good, and then I will show you like the right continuation knight to c3, which white should do. The idea is that now the most logical move would be bishop c3, defending the rook and attacking the queen at the same time. But here black has a trick, which if someone does play this should know about it. So what should black play here to get an advantage? Get a winning position actually. That's right, bishop to b4, which is actually a very strong move. So it creates the pin onto the bishop. Now the bishop is under attack by two pieces. White has really like two choices, both of them are bad. If he captures on b4, then we follow up with a knight take capture, which is threatening knight to c2. At the same time, the queen is threatening on a1, and it's just like completely losing. Like, the best move for white is actually to play knight to a3, but then black can just capture it. And right now black is up a piece, plus there are still problems with this king on e1, and the c2 pawn is still weak as well. The other move would be after bishop b4 to play queen to d2, thinking that I can just defend my bishop, and when you take it with black, I will be able to go capture back with the queen and still defend my rook. But unfortunately for white, black has the finishing move, queen to c1, which is a very fast checkmate. Now, but as someone asked, and the same way I mentioned, this opening, if it works, it's great, it's actually winning. But if white knows what to do and plays, instead of the bishop c3 move, knight to c3, then suddenly the tables have turned and black is the one in problem. Because even though there's no material weaknesses, like no material down for black, there is just not enough pieces out, plus the queen is going to lose some extra tempos later on. So black could try to, for example, bring out their bishop to b4, again trying to put some pressure on this knight on c3, but there is a very simple solution for white. Just rook to b1, attacking the queen has to go away, and then rook to b3. There are some other moves as well, knight d5, knight b5, but for me I always just prefer just go rook to b3, the queen moves away to a5 because it's still in danger, and now just the very simple pawn to e4 move, which is just going to get white a giant attack with strong center, more developed pieces, and a lot of tactical chances later on with knight to b5, knight to d5. This opening is just, like the position itself is just crushing for white. So yeah, I mean, you could, like the question meant, yes, black could try to not take on b2, but if the whole opening, giving up the pawn on e5, and then trying to do this queen b4 check, is building on taking on b2 and using this trick. So if this trick is not working, because the opponent knows what to do, then it's just not working. And there are plenty of openings which are just gives much better chances for black without doing this sacrifice, which is, I mean, it is kind of a gamble. And it's not a good gamble because nowadays more and more people know about it. So I would say the England Gambit is not something you can play or you should play. You can try it maybe in some blitz games or some just like friendly competition, but in serious play it is just not really viable. And this is one of those opening traps which is like, it is more of a trap than an opening because it's only built on for the trap. If you want to look for something of a more interesting one which could come out and be played by both sides and very normal, is for example something like the Cambridge Springs. This is a very common opening against d4 again. So we have d4, d5, c4, which is the Queen's Gambit. Now, okay, it's not a real gambit because after taking on c4, obviously that pawn is going to get captured back. So e6 goes the Queen's Gambit declined, and knight to c3, knight f6, all very, very normal. Bishop g5, and comes knight to d7, which is one of the main moves. The other moves could be bishop to e7 or c6, but knight b7 is very, very common. It puts the knight on the knight square, it's covering on f6 and so on. But at the same time, it is setting up an opening trap. So white could think that, oh, that knight went out, but at the same time, it did block the queen covering the d5 pawn, and I could just go capture on d5, and when they capture back, I could take this pawn with white because I have this very, very strong pin for white. And you can't take it because I take your queen. So this is a trap which happens in an opening. It could come out, but actually it is not good to take for white. Now, why is it not good for white to take on d5? So what could black do which fails white plan? Because it looks like white just captured the pawn, which cannot be captured back because of the pin. So this is at the same time as you are thinking, Yes, that is the answer, which is something when I started playing first, I was a kid, I started playing the Queen's Gambit. The first time it happened to me, I was like looking at it at the position, knight to d7, and I was thinking, why can't I just take the pawn? Because I have been playing this and no one started with knight d7 for me. That's right. So what I did, I captured once, and then in this position, I was just thinking for white, deciding, okay, what happens if I take? And like some people mentioned, what people can miss here is that they take on d5, and they say, okay, if you take, I just take your queen, and they stop calculating, which is one of the most common mistakes beginners do when they are calculating any variation, because the way they make a blunder is not just completely forgetting about something, but stopping calculation too early. And there is like different ways you can calculate, but one of the most basic rules you can follow, that you shouldn't ever stop calculating as long as there is a check or a capture in the position, because right now black can just do it. Check on b4, and now there's only one move, queen to d2 to block, because the king has no other space. And once the queen blocks, capture on d2, king takes back, and then king to d8, which is just a piece up now for black, for a pawn, but it shouldn't create any big problems for black to win it. So this is kind of a trap which could happen in an opening, where you play a completely normal opening, just change a little bit of differences like move order and set up a trap, which people can fall for if they don't. But even if they don't fall for it, the move knight to d7 was completely fine. And these are the kind of traps which are, I think, usable, or should be usable, because it doesn't worsen your position if your opponent doesn't fall for it. Yes, so calculation wise, yes, it is right. In a game, people, especially in the opening early on, a lot of people are going fast, thinking that, okay, this is just the usual thing, and then my opponent made a mistake and you can just take it. What I would say is, anytime when there is a new move which either you haven't seen or you haven't played against, something strange happening, and you can see it looks too good, so it looks obviously like a mistake, then it is just a nice idea to do double check and calculate the opening. The name of this opening, it is a Queen's Gambit declined, could be the Cambridge Springs Trap or defense, which would go forward like one of the main variations here, which is called the Cambridge Springs, is knight to f3, and the Cambridge Springs defense goes with c6, e3, and queen to a5, where there is another trap you can build up. Now, it is a very solid defense, and there is actually, again, a trap which black sets up for white. If white does just the very logical move bishop to d3, which looks like one of the best developing moves in the position, actually black is already better. So what could black do here to set up kind of a trick or a trap? So what could black do here to kind of create some pressure and threats? Because if we are looking for motives, we have a few patterns we could use to create some tactical chances as black. So here black has a few different options, but one of the biggest motive is this pin here, and there is one which is hard to see. Obviously you have the pin here, and there is one more trick which you have to notice, and this is the one which most people fall for, or like they forget about, and that is the sideways threats, which is one of the biggest element of creating blunders. Now the bishop b4, which a lot of people are suggesting, are very logical, creating some pressure on the c3 knight, but white is able to just defend it with something like queen to b3, or even sacrifice it for counterplay, and thinking that after all these captures, black is losing too many tempos, and giving out the bishop weakens the black squares as well, and white should have good enough compensation by a fast break. But the move, instead of bishop, now this is like obviously playable, but I would say white is fairly compensated for the opponent, has a nice attack. The move is, which black should play, is knight to e4, which is looking like a strange move, but it creates a threat onto c3 obviously, and at the same time sets up the main trick. And the main trick is here, if white is just like, okay, you're threatening my knight, it is defended by 1, you're attacking by 2, so I will just go and move my queen into position, defending it. Suddenly, black is winning, and black is able to win a piece somehow. So how could we go and win a piece with black? So bishop b4 is creating some pressure, but it is again just going for a pawn. We are looking for something stronger, which I saw, and that is, yes, to take on g5. And like I mentioned before, after capturing c4, we have a double attack, which is winning a piece. And again, sideways attacks, especially from a long range, so from one side to the other side, is the one which most people fall for, because we are just sitting in front of the board, they're looking at it from the front, so we are looking more over the files instead of the ranks. And this is just winning a piece. Okay, obviously white could capture back, but then we just take this knight and it's a piece up. Now knight e4 is not like immediately winning, because if white knows to do, the best move is actually to capture the knight, and after pawn capture there is the move knight to e5, which is still saving the piece. If the knight goes anywhere else, we can take this piece, and that bishop is just like a free one, but there is the move knight to e5, which is actually still okay for white. It is very, very complicated after this, but the best move actually will look very strange, but the best move for black is to go f6 and create a fork where after knight takes on d7, queen to g5. Now the knight on d7 is problematic, it has to take on f8, and then white can take on g2 and later on take back the knight. It is very complicated. I wouldn't really go into it, but it is actually working for black. But this is again an opening which sets up a trap with queen a5 for the move bishop to d3, after which knight e4 is a very, very strong move. But even if they do something else, like they could capture on f6, they could also at the same time play knight to d2, at the same time to defend knight against knight e4, this opening is completely fine for black. Even nowadays has been played. For example, it has been played by, was it Yeah, it was Carson Nakamura just a few months ago online where it has been played. So the opening is completely fine, and it at the same time it also has some traps as well. Now, what I would want to point out, if I can just quickly show some more, there are always tricks. So I would say with white, it is obviously an easier way because you are the one starting. So even though there are some traps you can fall into, it's more common for black to be on the losing side in these traps. There is another one which is very famous and probably have been seen before, which is e5, which is called the Budapest Gambit. I definitely know about this, have been played against this move quite a while. This is much better than the England Gambit, so if someone wants to learn a Gambit, then I would say this is something you could try to play. It is a better version than the England Gambit. After pawn capture, now there are two moves, knight to g4, which is the better move, but there's also knight f3, also knight to e4, which is not as strong. Now, there are some moves here, but I don't really want to go into the opening because it's all about the traps, and for that you just have to kind of try to develop and bring some, try to do logical moves, because that's what the trap is building for. So for example, knight f3 here is very logical, just developing, and comes d6, and here the best move for white is actually to just like play it logical, just play knight to do, try to develop, try to trade, and then later on just be up with the pawn. Black might have some open files, something after like capture, knight takes, bishop comes out, and then castles, and thinking that the bishops are a little bit open, the e file is open, and they are trying to do some compensation. But I would say if you just play safe in these positions with white, you should be okay. And later on, the one extra pawn should be good enough to get an advantage. But in this game, instead of knight to d2, white captured on d6, which I don't think was that much logical because it is developing the bishop without like gaining anything for white, and played a move, a bad move here. So play g3, which looks like a very logical move, just trying to get the bishop out to g2 and then go castle with white. Now the question is, why is this bad? What could black do to punish white for his momentary lapse in concentration? There is a very nice tactic. Now, we would obviously want to look over the checks, like bishop to b4, but the problem is that white can easily just play knight to d2, and that knight is defended by 4 pieces. Black just doesn't have enough to get through. So, what we have there is, yes, black is able to capture on f2, which is a very nice tactic, because it creates a typical fork on the e1 and h1. I mean, obviously white could move the queen, but then it's really not much. You just take the rook and you are better with black. And when the king captures back, we have a very nice discovered attack with a check paired and just winning the queen on d1. Now this is, again, a little tactic. It's a trap, but the opponent doesn't have to fall for it. But this is something where you could still get compensation, and a lot of these moves, for example here, g3 looks like a natural move. It is just forgetting about that there are some tactical elements into the position and not overlooking it. So what I would suggest for anyone who gets into a gambit opening or some kind of a tricky position, yeah, it is very, very important to look out for the opponent's threat and try to work out like why would they give up a pawn. Now obviously they could have just blundered, they could have made a mistake, but even then double checking something is just really worth it in the long run. Now this is in the Budapest Gambit. There is another variation which is very tricky. It is not a big trick, it is easy able to see, but after knight g4 or there is a move knight instead of knight of e4. Knight g4 is the better move actually. Knight f3, very logical. Knight c6, going after the e5 pawn. This is a little bit similar to the England Gambit. Bishop f4, bishop b4, knight to d2, and then now black plays queen to e7, which is again going after the pawn. Very, very logical. Now the best move for white, there are multiple moves, but I do like the move just a3. And the question is, like we are playing a blitz game, like we play a3, and the opponent just does this move. Now what should we do? Should we just take the bishop, or should we be a little bit scared? Because the most common things is just to be like completely forget about what your opponent could be doing, and this would be very, very painful to fall for. So now if we go greedy and just take on b4 without thinking, we just finished up the game, because knight to d3 checkmate using the very nice pin from e7. And this is something which I actually saw happen before in a tournament game. It wasn't a very, very serious tournament, it was just like some blitz tournament, but it did still happen next to me. So it is better to take on e5 with white, but then black goes and captures back on e5. So what now? Because now the same thing is threatening with knight to d3. So yeah, the move is just a very normal logical e3, and then bishop would capture now because it is hanging, no more checkmate threat. Queen captures back, and suddenly white is probably slightly bit better. Got a bishop pair which should give a slight advantage, but it's just a positional advantage, nothing crazy. And that would go on in theory. There are lots of different variations you could play continuing from here, but it is about okay. It's just the move queen to e7, and then letting your bishop hang is the one which should ring some warning bells in your head that you should check it, double check it just to be sure, because overlooking something in the opening is very, very common. Now obviously sometimes it does look like it is just a completely logical move what the opponent does, and that can create some threats as well. So for example, this is not really an opening threat because it happens later, but it can be happening in a few different structures. As again, it is a Queen's Gambit. I really know a lot of Queen's Gambit variations because that's the opening I play as well. It goes into main variation, very, very normal. Everyone's developing. So here, if black would wanted to, he could have tried to go for c6, which would have went into, if knight c3, the Cambridge Springs defense, which we saw before. But in the game came bishop e7, castle. Everyone is playing very, very straightforward chess. Queen to c2. White is waiting with developing the bishop, so black doesn't get a tempo after capture on c4. Comes a6, and then capture on d5, and bishop to d3. Very, very logical. c6, castle. Everything is completely normal. And in this position, like usually what this is, I would say one of the most common structures you can get in the Queen's Gambit declined. You will have the typical Carlsbad structure. There is a play for white to play with knight e5s later, or doing a minor attack on the queen side. But at the same time, there is one other trick which black has to be very careful about. So in the game, black played knight to e4, which is a typical way to try to trade some pieces and gain some space with black, because the idea would be that after knight takes, there is the move bishop takes, pawn takes, bishop is under attack, and if you take an any time on e7, the queen captures back and suddenly that pawn is defended. While if you take on e4, over here, there are some bishop g5s and they can get back the piece. Now we could take on h7, but black gets some compensation because we are losing some, and it's just not enough because the piece is going down on g5. So like we could capture, but even when we put back the bishop, it's just a piece done. So after knight e4, the best move for white is to play bishop f4, which is very, very normal. And here, black could play the normal knight to this f6, which is, again, it's completely okay. But in the game, black played f5, which looks very logical, creating a very strong knight, something similar to the stone wall. And yes, someone did mention the Rubinstein Trap, so they have seen this one before. But if someone doesn't know it, what could white do here to create a big advantage and potentially win the game? We could have traded the bishop, but it's actually not really a bad bishop, because even though our pawns are on black mostly, the bishop is in front of the pawns, so that makes it a pretty useful piece. So what could we do here for white? Yes, someone did mention it. It is the Rubinstein Trap, which yes, he did fall for a few times. Now normally what you would happen is like it happens to you once, you remember it and you learn it, never fall for it again. But white is just able to take on d5 and sacrifice the knight, capture, threatening knight c7, and if black just captures back, this is the move, bishop to c7, which is just winning the queen, and there is really no defense, white is just winning now. So even just the move, play a move f5 could create some problems, and a lot of the traps, opening traps are falling for, people are falling for is something which is not the obvious. Because if it's something like a sacrifice is threatening, like check, sacrificing, for example on f7 sometimes, then it is much more in people's mind and they are looking out for that trap. But leaving pieces on an undefended squares or maybe trapping their own piece is something which is much more common to fall for. Now let me just show you one tricky opening, which again it can happen in some e4 setup as well, and this is a very tricky one because it looks again very, very strange. So in the Spanish you have the very normal position, bishop to b5 going for the Ruy Lopez, and black plays knight f6, which is going for the Berlin defense. Now white could go castle, and then go into the main Berlin, but I think a lot of people have seen these ones before because it's just been so common in the last few months on online chess at the top level, where people have kept on playing this variation and different versions of the Berlin, and it is a very, very solid opening. But with white going, instead of castle, not letting black capture on e4, could play d3, which is going to the typical d3 Berlin, where the main variation is black to play bishop to c5. Then there is a typical trick that after capture, white cannot capture on e5 because queen to d4 is just a winning move, threatening checkmate and the knight. Now this is a trap, but I don't think anyone ever falls for it anymore because it's just been so common. But there is an interesting move here, which is not the best move, but it's actually not so bad. Knight to e7. And the question would be, why can't we just take the pawn on e5? Yes, it is pretty common. 95, then just like mentioned, c6, threatening the bishop. The bishop has to move. Well, it doesn't have to move, but otherwise the bishop just falls. And once it moves comes the queen a5 move, which is just taking the piece. And it is a sideway motif, which is the most common one to lose for. Now there is a very, very similar opening trick to this in the Sicilian as well. If someone plays against it with white, so for example plays knight f3, and the opponent plays d6, which is the most common one, there is the c3 Sicilian, which could be interesting with the idea of knight f6, bishop to c4, well, sorry, bishop to e2, which sets up the same kind of trick, which actually quite a few people have fallen for, where they just go capture the pawn and forget about the queen a4 move, which is again just winning the piece. There is quite a few openings which are moving the f pawn. There's like the Dutch, like there's the bird opening with white, which is not that much played, but it is usually much later on where people start moving their f pawns. It is not super uncommon, but usually there is a piece in the middle which we want to follow it up to get a strong solidification. Now we were looking at different kind of traps, and yeah, it is something you can fall for. There is one thing which we haven't really mentioned, and that is playing for a deliberate trap, which is actually with a tiny bit of difference into a normal opening. So for example, there is one in the Caro-Kann. So I don't know if anyone plays the Caro-Kann, but one of the main variations in the Caro-Kann goes like this: c6, d4, d5, knight to c3, and comes capture on e4, where white captures back, and then there are multiple openings here: knight to d7, knight to f6, but one of the most common moves is bishop to f5, which I think quite a few people have seen before. Now the theory goes here with knight to g3, bishop goes back, then you can start with knight f3 or h4, and then goes on in this variation with h5, bishop goes back, knight to f3, e6, bishop to d3, and it goes on and on. This is a long variation, the Caro-Kann, which I wouldn't say it's bad or anything. It is playable for both sides. But the idea of that is that if someone, for example, play this one with black, and they would just go on to an autopilot, and then after c6, instead of d4, white would play, for example, knight to c3, comes the move d5, and there is a very annoying move for black here, which is knight to f3. And if someone is just used to the normal Caro-Kann and they just only play one variation, for example the bishop f1 5-1, which I mentioned last time or just before, they could go and capture an e4 now, which is actually not terrible but not the best, and after knight e4 just play bishop f5 thinking, okay, what's the difference? You will go d4 sooner or later and it is just the same thing. And this does happen a few times, even for me, just like not really considering what could be a difference, just keeping going with my own variation, and there is a big difference here, because after knight to g3 the bishop is under attack. Now bishop g4 is possible even now, which is actually probably a little bit of a better move, or even immediately bishop g4 instead of bishop f5, or even instead of taking on e4. It is all completely fine, but the idea is that when someone goes into this variation, they are used to the same position, but the only difference is the pawn on d4 and the knight on g1. And yes, even without taking on e4, bishop g4 is good. That is one of the main moves. And thinking that there are no difference, because white will go d4, I will go e6, and then we will just go and transpose into the usual variation, which I just showed before. But there is a big difference, because after h4, threatening to trap the bishop, obviously with h5, black has to play h6, and because white has knight to f3 instead of d4, can play knight e5, which is actually just creates a giant advantage for white. Now the best move is actually queen to d6 and just giving up the bishop later, but it is just a very strong position for white, because the bishop is going to come to d4, threatening the queen, and there is just like a lot of tempos which black is losing. So after knight e5, almost all people who I have since seen in this position play bishop h7, going back to defend and trying to hold it from there. So let's see if we can improve a little bit on this. So here white is actually close to winning if you can find the best solution. So how would you attack with white? So yeah, we have one option. Queen f3, queen b3 is a very typical way to go after. So, but there is a better version for the queen f3, queen b3 threat, and we would want to go after a little difference with our knight on e5, which is actually to go queen to h5, because knight is doing the same threat, threatening on f7. Now black has a few ways to defend it. So they could go pawn to g6, which is blocking the bishop, and then creating a really bad bishop, almost like a pawn. And the other move is queen to d5, after which we have the very strong move bishop to c4, which is creating a giant threat onto f7. So the best move for black, even though it's not great, is to go, instead of queen d5, just go g6, and then we can play queen to f3, going for the same threat onto f7. Now black can defend this again with either knight to f6. I could move the queen to d5 as well. After which, what is the solution? How can white win here? So bishop c4 is an option, but the problem is they take the knight with a check, and then after that they will just decide to play some like e6 and defend their pawn. So we can't forget about our opponent's counter threat. We can't do that because there is no pawn on d4, because we played with the knight f3 move order. So what we could do here is again do a little bit of calculation, and for calculation really the most simple thing I heard, I think I heard it when I was around like 8 years old. One of my coaches in my chess club mentioned, when you're calculating, all you have to do is look for checks, captures and attacks, which is what you want to do in most positions. So we can obviously start calculating, and we could take on f7, but that's not good because the queen can take. But we can, like someone mentioned, take on d5, they have to capture back, and then we do a check, which they have to move. Now if their king moves, we can just go follow up with another check. The king moves away, we take the rook, and it is just winning for us. They could obviously, after bishop b5 check, try to block with the knight, but again we look for checks, captures, and then obviously you'd want the bishop to capture at the end, so you just take on c6, and when they capture back you do a bishop, and finishing off with a nice fork again. So this is again a very nice way to just finish it up, and even though it is a few moves of calculation, as long as it is forcing moves, so checks or captures, it is way easier to calculate, and sometimes you can go even longer, even 5-10 moves. As for my audio, it might be something wrong with it. Settings should be normal, but I will try to fix it for a sec next time. As for chats, I am following on Twitch and on YouTube. In the game, what black did, or like what black usually does, is go knight to f6, and then we set up the same trick. We go queen to b3, threatening on b7 and an f7. One is obviously stronger because that is a checkmate on f7. And the only move for black to defend is to go queen d5, trying to create a counterattack and blocking our queen. But here there is a very nice solution, which is just taking the pawn on b7. And even though they can take the knight with a check, we just block it, and next move we either do checkmate, which is most likely going to be defended, or we take the rook and going to be ahead with white. Now this is an opening trap, which really just builds on someone's knowledge already about an opening and changing one little move order. So instead of d4, starting with knight f3 and going into the same variation, but that one difference can mean a giant threat which black can fall for, and it is actually surprisingly common way that people can and will fall into just by doing a little bit of a move order difference. Because most people go into and play the opening just very very fast and carelessly. Well, not even carelessly, but it's because it has been played so many times and you get the same position so many times, people's awareness and like kind of like danger sense is really low. So the best advice for opening traps, looking out for opening traps, or playing openings you might want, which might have opening traps, is be careful anytime your opponent plays something new, something strange. Try to double check and always look over those checks, captures, attacks, because that is a really easy way to calculate and check out some of these threats. And if you are playing any, or want to play any gambits which has some traps, like what I meant even here in this, the Caro-Kann or something in the D4 opening, there are plenty of variations which could give you some nice chances, but you would want to choose a kind of a trap and an opening which, even if your opponent doesn't fall for it, is playable, is okay. Because if you are playing an opening just for the trap, most of the people will learn it, or even if they fall for it once, they are not going to fall for it again, and then we learn from it, and then that opening is not really playable. Now, for a final little trick is against something against the Italian, which I think many people have seen before or have been played before, because it is very very common. The move knight to d4. I don't know if anyone have seen this one before, but it is very very tricky, and again it's all about understanding that the opponent is setting up something, because knight d4 is not normal, it is not a usual move. So the obvious question is, like, what happens if we take on e5, because that's what we have to start looking for. So what do you think should be the move for black to follow up? Like, what could black create to set up some tricks here? As for what time control is best for learning new lines, I would suggest something on the shorter side of rapid games. Something like 15 minutes plus 10-second increment, because you would still want to take relatively some time in the middle game to have some time to practice those positions, but you don't really have that much time to spend in like a whole game, and you want to get more and more positions out. So anything between 10 and 15 minutes with some kind of an increment is pretty good. And yes, I can see someone mentioning the tricks. So the move is queen to g5, threatening the knight and threatening on g2. Now, if white captures on f5, f7 with the knight, trying to create a counter fork, actually he's already lost, because after queen g2, the rook is under attack. Not to mention it is very very threatening. So if they go rook f1, the problem is the move queen takes e4 check, and it has to be blocked by the bishop, and then there is a very nice knight to f3 checkmate. So allowing on f7 is okay. Now white doesn't have to fall for it. So after queen g5, for example, white could take with the bishop, and after king to d8 go castle, which is sacrificing a piece on e5, but white has got 2 pawns for it. We'll have the center, so something like pawn to c3, and then when the knight goes back, maybe defending the pawn on e4 should be a priority, so maybe rook e1 and then later on something like d4. It's not completely lost, but it is better for black. But obviously if you go super greedy and take an f7 with the knight, then it is just completely over. But it doesn't mean the move knight to d4 is good, because it is actually not good. It is again one of those openings which are only good if your opponent falls for it, because if white just plays the very simple knight capture, pawn capture and castle, there are other moves as well, but castle might be the easiest. Now white has a big development advantage, a very nice bishop, a very simple play of pushing up in the center and just having a much nicer position. So even though there are some traps in openings, you would want to choose one which is playable. Why defend? I see. So yes, in that final variation I just mentioned, there is a way to why defend the pawn on e4. You could not, you don't have to defend it, but it is really one of the strongest pawns for white, so you not want it to be taken. Now I would do one final little trick, which is something I think many people have seen. Again, it is something which can happen. It is most common in the exchange rule opens, which is e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5 and a6. Now this could come out in a little bit different versions, but this is the most common. Bishop takes, pawn takes, obviously opening up the bishop on c8, and once white castles, the move bishop to g4, which is very logical, creating a nice spin for black. Now what happens usually here is white is trying to kick away the bishop on g4, and yes, someone did mention it before, the move h5, which is if black does, it sets up something called a fishing pole trap or mate. It is a trick which can happen, but again, white doesn't have to fall for it. So the idea is, if white captures just greedily, then black captures, and suddenly this rook and the file is opening up, and after knight takes on e5, the move queen h4 is just finishing, because the checkmate is undefendable. Even though white could try to open up, the move g3 is just finishing black, because now the king is just impossible to escape. Now white doesn't have to fall for it, so again after h5 the most normal move is actually to go d3 and not falling for it. So being on point, like if anything strange or dangerous is happening, you just want to stop it and take a minute, or even if you're playing a blitz game, like 5-minute blitz game, like take 20-30 seconds, look at it and see like, okay, why is the opponent just doing this? Because they are trying to win as well. They might make a mistake, but most likely they are setting up some traps. Now, opening traps, there are plenty. I would say what everyone should try to do is decide on some openings they like. They like their style, they like the positions which come out from it, and then try to learn the traps and tricks connected to that opening, so that you can either create the chance or not fall for it if your opponent goes into it. And by learning those very simple traps and tricks, every once in a while you might be able to win a game freely, because the opponent falls for it. But I would say going for traps are really the only point is if you play an opening you already know and it is a playable opening. I wouldn't play any opening just for the trap. Now, working. Oh, that is a very simple question. Where are you solving tactics? Me personally, I do solve tactics on my board. I get a chess book. There are very many chances. Like you can look for different encyclopedias, combination books. There are lots of great ways to do it online. For example, Chess24 has some as well. You could just go online and do any kind of puzzles. But personally, the best way to improve on your calculation, I think, is you could find some hard puzzles, put it out on a board, and think about it. Don't move the pieces, try to do it in your head, write down your answers, and then later on check and assess what you missed, what you didn't miss, and what you should improve on. Now, if does anyone have any specific question about any opening trap? Because I think it is mostly you have to try to be logical and reasonable. So if there's something which looks too good to be true, you would want to check. I guess the bishop's opening, not really. You can't really do much gambit against it. I mean, one of the stronger moves is knight to f6, which with the idea is after d3 you could play c6 and then d5. Okay, the orangutan, no, I wouldn't say anything very interesting. It is really mostly just get the position with the diagonal, and that's what you want to try to use. I don't think there is any common trap which strong players fall for. I think it is more common to forget about something over like sideways, so over ranks. There is no specific one, but that's usually what people can be forgetting about, because really that is like, we are looking at it like straight. For me, I do what I forget sometimes, and that is a lot of people do, is when I'm calculating, I kind of like don't calculate over all of my opponent's chances. So I forget about sometimes an in-between check or in-between capture, some of these moves which can sometimes like make you lose the game. So I would say just like any of these traps goes down to just like being careful, being aware of like there are problems you can fall for if you are not careful, and just looking out for those checks and captures. Alright, so I think that's it for today. I would suggest really anyone, if you like some of these traps or some of these positions, just try it out, play some blitz games, see how you feel about them, but try to look for openings which are very like playable, good, or even like great, which might have some traps, but that shouldn't be the main idea. Yeah, there are a few different tips. Alright, so thank you for everyone for watching, and good luck to your chess games.